This week we're with Rich Kershaw. As we've literally just been discussing, I think Rich has done everything from advising CTOs, worked with every sort of kind of business in the book. So, Richard, for people who don't know who you are, do you just want to give a background about, where you are now, what you've done, what companies you've worked with, etc.?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a professional CTO and tech consultant. I've been in the industry for about 20 years, CTOing for about 15. Originally, my background was in the digital marketing sector, but having founded some companies as a branch off from digital marcoms, at this point, I've worked with probably upwards of 60 or 70 different companies, small, medium, large. Small end of the spectrum, small e-commerce houses, small businesses starting up, trying to make their way, working with tech providers who can help them, right up to the likes of IBM, Fujitsu, Siemens, and Department for Transport, writing white papers on data and customer retention strategy. These days, I'm a tech consultant, and I primarily work with startups and startup investment houses on a combination of due diligence, getting those startups prepared for investment, analysing their infrastructure, figuring out how best they can position themselves for due diligence and onwards, and then helping them grow and come up with scaling strategies from there. And that includes commercials and technology architecture.
Cool, perfect. I think number one question, obviously, people watching this is, during COVID, how are you seeing companies scaling up and what strategies are they using to, obviously it's a bit of a strange time at the moment. So is there one particular strategy that works, or is there some new ones in the pipeline?
There is no single strategy that's going to work for every company. Hopefully that kind of goes on. You've been a bit worried if I'd said, yes, everybody needs to be doing this one thing. If it were that easy, then I think we'd both be out of jobs. I mean, there are a few strategies in the time of COVID. I think it depends on the industry that you're working in. Primarily, if you're in a B2B industry where it's about B2B software platforms, B2B SaaS platforms, or even enterprise IT systems, then the thing which everybody is really paying a very close eye to at the moment is collaboration and teamwork tools. So it's less about choices of technology. No one's dumping Java for Node.js or Node.js for a Python stack purely on the basis of COVID. What they are doing is accelerating the process of pushing out CI/CD tools, using cloud-based deployment, continuous deployment, and test tools running on things like GitLab, GitHub Enterprise, and really reconsidering the requirements, both from point of view of teamwork and also audit, around cloud-based tools versus on-prem. So my previous experience of having worked with enterprise software development teams is that there does tend to be a real bias towards having things like on-site continuous integration servers and on-site build servers. And for remote workers, that used to be a bit of a headache. So for dedicated in-house IT systems providers, the IT department is very conventionally in a little bit of a conflict with the engineering team over things like remote access and VPN tunnels. That's starting to get smoothed out now, because a lot of the very conventional wisdom about what you need to do to maintain a security compliant environment for your developers has gone out the window. It's not a question anymore. You have to do it. So rolling in ISO compliance, GDPR compliance, and various other cybersecurity footprint analysis technologies into your estate of things like hosted GitHub and hosted GitLab is now becoming the standard thing that IT security teams are doing. And that's great for developers, because it means that they're building on a much more standardized stack. Their engineering management don't have the luxury of being able to uber customize everything about the way they build things. Having on-prem servers where someone needs to physically go into an office, deal with server reboots and upgrades and high availability, is much less practical, because remote working is the default as it stands. So there's some pain in the short term, because migrating from on-prem systems to cloud-based systems is always going to be a bit of a pain. But in the long term, software developers working with these systems, especially in the Java world, where dependency hell is frequently just part of the job, I'm hopeful that they're going to find that those pain points get much reduced, because they'll be by default working on much more standardized cloud-based platforms. And they will probably for the first time have their IT department on board with that, because it will make those IT engineering staff's jobs much easier, rather than, as it was previously, much harder to figure out how the overlap between your internal IT systems and cloud-based tech works. On the B2C side of things, it's much more competitive. Businesses that had never really been thinking about the need to deal with e-commerce as their primary channel, and in some cases now only channel, especially during proper lockdown, are suddenly getting a bit of a rude awakening. The need to think about the impact that your web stack has on customer experience is super important. And especially when you look at, mid-market companies who are using full stack development tools, either with third-party agencies or as part of their in-house resource. They're now finding that the majority of their sales, up to 90 to 95% of their sales, even before lockdown, are going through e-commerce channels. So I'll do that a little bit again because of the notification, if you like.
Fine, mate.
And so that puts extra pressure on. You've got to think about scaling to an extent that you just didn't have to before. Running, a simple WordPress with e-commerce enabled website on one server might have suited a mid-market company when the majority of what they sold was via direct business contacts and physical retail. Now that the majority of their business is coming via e-commerce, they have to think much more keenly about things like serverless, containerized computing. These will be uncomfortable conversations for people who possibly aren't that technical. So developers need to be thinking in a much more DevOpsy way, because their internal stakeholders are going to expect to be having conversations about this stuff and using terms they will have come across that developers would never have expected to be coming from internal product owners. So I think developers need to be focusing on being much more of a full service engineering head rather than just a fulfiller of specification documents.
Yeah, perfect. I know obviously you've worked across an array of companies, but from sort of the last technology company you worked with, what's the most popular language and tools they tend to use for startups?
So I see a mix of different stuff. Python is huge. There is a surprising amount of Kotlin for server-side coming through, which is obviously very good for the JVM community. Maybe 5 or 6 years ago, when I first started encountering Kotlin, it was almost entirely skunkworks projects and test stuff coming out of Google's R&D departments intended for Android. The team that I was managing at the time really liked Kotlin. It's very clean, especially compared to sort of raw Java. And the fact that it's very widely supported by the JVM for full stack development is really positive. It's got a good ecosystem. It's getting to be quite mature. That's quite popular. There's a certain amount of stuff going on with .NET, less so. But if I was starting a full stack software project right now, and I wanted to look for a resource that was mature, knew what they were doing, that they had good enterprise experience, I think probably server-side Kotlin on the JVM would be the way I'd go.
Yeah, perfect. And just more of sort of a business question, during COVID, what's the sort of maybe top 1 or 2 challenges that startups are facing? Appreciate obviously sales is probably the most important thing, but is there any other points that have been standing out for you?
Yeah, absolutely. Communication is absolutely key. And that's going to be the biggest problem. Interestingly, one of the observations that I've made, and I do quite a lot of technology due diligence work, as I mentioned earlier, one of the trends is that early stage startups are increasingly remote. Oh.
Sure.
Held that until the end of the sentence. So you've got a couple. Yeah, so with early stage startups, it's much easier for them to go the fully 100% remote route from the get-go.
Sure.
There are a lot of firms which were founded sort of a year, maybe 6 months before the start of the pandemic, who have seen the writing on the wall as far as the, the direction of teamwork. Virtual co-working spaces have started to become the way things are done, especially in the London tech scene. And for them, they've actually probably had the least painful pandemic response to anyone.
Yeah.
A little bit more painful than that has been slightly more established companies where they had a small team and they recognized that nurturing the team culture was super important. And that's been a little bit jarring for them. So heavy use of Slack, Zoom, internal teamwork tools to do things like regular ongoing employment 360 assessments and so forth. That's super important. It's not about maintaining a constant panopticon view of what all of your staff are doing at all times. There's actually a huge amount of negativity around the kinds of companies who've insisted that, everybody wears smart shoes when they're on Zoom calls, and, you leave a video call open in the background throughout the day so that everybody can feel like they're in the office.
Yeah.
It's not an office environment, and there are pros and cons to that. But daily check-ins, regular team stand-ups, good information sharing via services like Teams and Slack. Those are the ways that I've seen companies succeeding, and almost inevitably where they lose control of their roadmap and staff start to feel like they're freewheeling a little bit. It's because their managers and their team leads haven't made the space to prioritize team communication and make sure that everybody feels like they are still part of a coherent team. It's not that difficult to do. It is more time consuming than it used to be, but actually teams who are doing that really effectively are finding that they can be just as efficient, because what they lose in time spent on Slack and team stand-ups via Zoom, they gain in terms of people being able to focus on specific jobs during crunch times.
Sure. No, that's really interesting. I think that's about it. Is there any other sort of information or anything else you'd like to add?
That's a really good question. Let me think for a moment. It's been a busy morning. You can probably tell I'm coming off the back of another couple of meetings. Yeah, I think the excuse me, startups who are pre-seed or pre-Series A are going to find that there's a lot more scrutiny on their process than there was before. Pre-pandemic, due diligence around software products was primarily around, the stability of architecture and whether or not the right choice of technology had been made, and how easy it would be for that company to recruit the right people to support their platform as time went on. The focus now is all of those things, but upfront, all of that serves questions around team coherence and delivery function in a fully remote environment. And that's really where the focus is for investors. It's much less around validating whether or not the technology choices are right, although that is still part of the process. It's much more about saying, well, how does that key into the way that our staff work with each other? Investors are much more interested in things like continuous integration and deployment processes. Previously that was probably likely to have been a thing which they would have left up to a generic question around how confident they were in the tech leadership and the senior architects. Do we think they've got the chops to do this job? Yes, we do. Well, then we trust that they've built a sensible process for deploying their software. Now, we're doing a lot more digging into that and trying to figure out whether or not that process serves a remote team, because it's far, far easier with a fully remote team who've got free reign over your deployment environment to accidentally deploy out a bug or something that's going to affect the stability of your product. And if you've got a big estate of SaaS clients, that's critical. It's the kind of thing where if you're doing daily stand-ups and your deployment manager is sitting at the desk across from you, you can say, hey, Dave, are you all right if I do this software deployment? And you can go, no, don't do that. We haven't done the full check-in and merge yet. In this environment, unless you've got the communications in place, that's a much, much riskier environment. So controls around how that works and audit around how you're doing that kind of team working on software deployments is so important. It's coming under much more scrutiny.
Yeah, there's one question I've actually just come into my head actually that you'll probably know. Is there any sort of industries that are scaling, head and shoulders above the rest at the moment? Is there any standout industries that people like to find out about?
So, I mean, I can certainly tell you what the hot topics are. I mean, if anyone's been keeping an eye on Angel List and Crunchbase and other investment lists, this won't be a surprise. HR tech, absolutely huge. So companies looking to tackle all of the stuff that I just talked about with teamwork and collaboration, that is booming right now. Health tech, for obvious reasons, even if not necessarily COVID, directly COVID related. Things like remote assessment platforms, hands-off triage, that sort of thing is quite big. And everything around development tools and democratizing AI. So, I definitely advise people to keep an eye on AI and ML. Previously, it's been something where unless you're really an enthusiast or you're directly working on a machine learning project, you probably won't have a great deal of familiarity with it. But it's getting to an inflection point in that market where startups working on machine learning technologies are not quite so much focusing on the real low-level raw stuff where it's going to be powered by a team of PhDs out of Cambridge. They're focusing on ways to democratize and make that technology more accessible. So, personally speaking, I'm not deeply embedded in the world where you'd be getting into the specifics of building your ML models and your AI matrices and figuring out exactly how that feeds in to the underlying ML frameworks coming out of Google's R&D departments. What I am interested in knowing is, how do I use it? What can I do with it? If I feed this batch of data in, what can I expect to get out the other side? And crucially, what's the fastest path for me to get my spreadsheet of 10,000 rows of user data through an ML model and into a prediction pattern, which I can then deploy out? And how do I deploy it and how do I maintain it? Those are the technologies which are really being pushed right now. And I think that anybody who is looking at what's coming down the line next in software development should be keeping an eye on technologies like Docker and Kubernetes and how they work with platforms like Microsoft Azure and AWS, because that's actually where the real cutting edge stuff is happening around AI and machine learning, figuring out how to get your models out into the cloud, turn them into APIs, and then start integrating them into applications. I think in maybe 4 or 5 years' time, if as an architect you don't know how to do this stuff, you're going to be at a disadvantage.
Yeah, that's perfect. Well, thanks very much for your time, Rich. That's really interesting and helpful. For everyone's watching, I'll put Rich's website. He's got his own personal website and his email address in there as well. So any questions or anything at all, feel free to reach out to him. But thanks for your time, Rich. Much appreciated.
Pleasure.
Have a nice day. Cheers.
Okay, thanks, James.